looks like a lot of you are here. Some are still coming. That's great. I'm Christy Merrick. I'm the Director of Natural Start, and I'm so happy to welcome you to our forum on reflective practice. I'm here with Emily Van Lan. She's here as Natural Start on the screen. She's going to help monitor the chat and provide support. Thank you so much, Emily. And back to this. There we go. It went too far. I'm so happy to introduce our speaker today, Diona Reese Williams. Dee is an advisor to Natural Start. And recently, a group of us were talking about this really challenging time that educators are facing right now. It's just a really tough time to be a teacher today. And Dee shared that in her past life as a social worker, she learned a really valuable approach to professional collaboration called reflective practice. And she said that it really helped her process and navigate challenges at work. And she thought it's a practice that could be really helpful to educators right now. So we're really grateful that she was willing to come and share her perspective about reflective practice, and especially bringing that background in social work that a lot of us don't have, but is so really applicable right now in this time. Dee is the owner of Outback Learning in Arizona. She is a professor of early childhood education and host of the Black in Nature podcast. Just does so much for the field. We're so grateful to have her expertise as part of the Alliance. If you have any questions or anything that you want to share with the group while she's talking, just freely use the chat. We'll have time for questions and discussion. We can pause along the way if you like. So feel free to use that resource. We're really looking forward to what everyone has to say about this topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dee, at this point, and thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christy and Emily and Natural Start Alliance for this opportunity. I'm going to quickly share my screen. And since you already did an introduction, I feel like I can dive right into this conversation. And so today I'm going to be talking about reflective practice and just really talking about my journey into this work. And we'll just go from there. So some of the objectives that I want to try to cover today is really talking about reflective practice versus reflective supervision in early childhood education, understand the purpose of reflective practice, discuss how reflective practice can be utilized in your current roles, and then also identifying strategies and other resources that can be used in terms of reflective practice and working with young children and educators. Again, thank you for the introduction. So I will save you all your ears of hearing that all again. So one of the things I want to talk about is the first time I was introduced to the concept of reflective supervision. This was very, I would say, I feel like it was kind of early on in my career. It was back in 2011. I was working at one of our local nonprofits, Easter Seals Blake Foundation. And I was an early interventionist service coordinator. And so my role was to work with families with children that were possibly having some sort of developmental delays between the ages of birth to 3. And so while I was working for the agency in the state of Arizona, we had so much, I would say, a lot of change and growth happening in early childhood. A lot of movement. First things first was one of our state agencies that just became really the voice of early childhood education. And at the time, First Things First decided to fund this particular practice called reflective supervision. And although I wasn't working in a clinical capacity, the organization I was with, we also provided other different types of services for children ranging from birth to 3. And so when I heard about reflective supervision, I had never heard of the concept. At that point, everything I knew about early childhood was primarily in the classroom. That's what I was taught. And even being an early interventionist at the time, that was still a very new concept for me as well. And so basically, it also introduced me to the term infant toddler mental health. And if you've never heard of this term, I feel like today we use that term, and then also early childhood mental health as well. So these are like two different concepts. And then when I think about today, we've just really transitioned. And with reflective supervision, it gave me an opportunity to meet with my supervisor every single week. And I thought, I'm just being honest, like the idea that I was going to meet with my supervisor every week, I'm like, every week for 2 hours or an hour and a half, like what can we possibly be talking about during this time? And during the funding part of us really going through reflective supervision, they really taught us the purpose behind it. And the idea was for me to be able to go meet with my supervisor and talk about very specific cases related to the children and families that I was working with. And then also during that time, I was going through the reflective supervision process collectively as a group to hopefully work towards endorsement. It's not something I ended up doing, but I basically experienced both at the same time while being educated in the process and learning a new role. But what I gained from that experience was that I felt like I was no longer taking the cases home. And when you're working with children, and you're working with families and you're going into their homes, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. There's a lot of the social emotional aspect of it. It's the relationship part of it. And that's the whole point of reflective supervision, is really looking at the parallel process and the dynamic between you and the child, you and the family, between myself and my supervisor. And then just trying to find ways to basically support the families and the children that I was working with. So that's just an idea of how I got into the work. And then over time, I found, because I was trained to be reflective, it's just a concept that I've never truly walked away from. I still use reflective practice in a lot of ways in the way that I work today. So that's just a little backstory. So reflective practice versus reflective supervision. I feel like there's two different pieces to it, because again, I was introduced to the reflective supervision aspect, but I wasn't quite familiar with reflective practice in terms of an educator standpoint. So when I understood, the way that I interpret the two is reflective supervision looks at the parallel process within relationships, such as supervisor to supervisee, the educator to child, or the parent-child relationship. But in reflective practice, when it comes to educators, it's really reflecting on the work I felt like individually. Is that the case today? Not necessarily. There's more research and resources available, really trying to help educators understand that you can do this work. You don't have to do it in isolation. So let's keep going. So when it comes to reflective supervision, and I just want to kind of define it, but let me minimize some things at the top. When it comes to exploring the parallel process, the attention on all the relationships is important, including the ones between the practitioner and supervisor, and between the practitioner and parent, and between parent and infant toddler, and is critical to understand how each of these relationships affect the others. So I'm trying to give you guys some definitions, and then we'll go into the objectives a little bit more. It also relates to the professional and personal development within one's discipline by attending to the emotional content of the work and how the reactions to the content relates to the work. So basically, when I think about today, and I think about the conversations I've had with educators, and I still have a lot of friends that work in public education, and just going through everything we've gone through in the last 2 years, and just people being so exhausted and just tired of being kind of reactive to things and not feeling like they have a sense of control. This is where I really think reflective supervision can be really helpful in these present day times. But okay, let me keep going through the definition. Also, the importance of reflective supervision is to emphasize on the supervisor and the consultant's ability to listen and wait, and allowing the supervisee to discover solutions, concepts, perceptions on his or her without interruption from the supervisor and consultant. So all of that to say this, the one thing that I really had to accept when it came to this type of practice is there wasn't always an answer. And I couldn't really control what was happening within my families that I was working with or with the children. I really had to just but I still needed a place to have an outlet to discuss these things because it can become really frustrating. When I was working with a family and say, for instance, they were super frustrated that the services were not available for their child. Well, we live in a very, very rural community. And although it was frustrating, I just couldn't change the fact that I could not have a speech language pathologist go into the home. And so these were the discussions I would have with my supervisors, like, well, the parents are really frustrated. I don't know what to do. The child they still need speech services. Like, what do we do? And so as the supervisor, it wasn't so much like, okay, well, we're just going to hire someone. They've been trying to hire someone for 2 years, but there wasn't like a right or wrong answer. So it was really just the supervisor would listen and just kind of allow me to process and get to a point of like, well, how can I get to a conclusion about this? What are some ways that I can help support this family in a different way? Could we use another type of service? What do we currently have available? What are the resources in the community? So again, I think that's the struggle in today is like a lot of things are out of our control, but how can we kind of find some peace in a situation where there is no control? So the primary objectives for reflective supervision and consultation is to form trusting relationships between the supervisor and practitioner. This is so important. I will say, and with that particular supervisor, what I liked about learning about this concept, there may have been things in terms of leadership that I didn't agree with at the time, but she was really good. We had really clear boundaries when it was time to have these reflective conversations that there was enough trust there that we could have deeper conversations and not just surface conversations. And it was understood. It wasn't a time in which the supervisor was going to say to me, you know, Diona, I noticed you're coming in at 8:15 as opposed to 8 o'clock. That was not the intent of the space. Also establishing a consistent and predictable meetings in times. And I think this is a really important concept because when you're working in social work, you're working with the community, you're working with families, you're working with children, you're working within systems. There's a lot of things, again, you can't control, and having a consistent, predictable time that I knew I'm going to be meeting with my supervisor Thursday at 3 o'clock, and we're going to meet from 3 to 4 or 3 to 5, whatever the case may be. And I knew I could bring 2 really tough cases that I'm like, you know, this little guy is in foster care, they're 6 months old, they were premature, and we could really talk about what is it about that particular case that may be triggering for me, or how I could support the foster family and also supporting the family during that time, the biological family. But it gave me, instead of being reactive to the situation, I was able to just go and talk with the supervisor during the designated time. And I feel like that just minimized like the crisis mode of all of it. Or having a child placed, a child that is currently with their family, and then they're suddenly removed and placed in a foster care situation. Instead of like reacting to the situation, this could happen on a Tuesday, but I knew I was going to meet with my supervisor on Thursday. So I could really talk about like, man, this is really tough. I can't believe this happened. It just made it just more tolerable, I think, for me. Asking questions that encourage details about the infant, parent, and emerging relationships, And again, this is very tailored to reflective supervision in terms of infant toddler mental health. Remain emotionally present. I mean, that was one of the, I feel like the concept that I've really had to work on the most as someone who tends to daydream and everything else in a meeting was learning how to be present in situations, and especially during the reflective process. So I could be an active listener. And so my supervisor could be an active listener too, teaching and guiding, nurture and support, apply the integration of emotion and reason, foster the reflective process to be internalized by the supervising, and then explore the parallel process and to allow time for the personal reflection. And that part is the key, is making sure that there's time to look at the parallels between the various relationships and how, and just being able to have that time to personally reflect and then attend to how reactions to the content affect the process. I know that was a lot, but I promise I think it gets a little bit better. So reflective practice in early childhood, the pedagogy. So reflective practice in the cycle of ongoing learning that occurs when early childhood professionals take the time to stop, think, challenge, and change their practices in order to incorporate new understandings and advance children's learning and development. So some of the key points or characteristics of effective reflective practice, and this is more, I feel like, a little bit more relatable as an educator. What I didn't know at the time, and I'll get into this in my next story, is that because I was able to learn about reflective supervision from more of a clinical standpoint, that I could still apply these concepts even when I was in the classroom. So the characteristics would be active focus on goals, including how these might be addressed and the potential of consequences of these. A commitment to continuous cycle of monitoring, so evaluating, revisiting your practices. These are all things I feel like I don't want to assume that educators do, but I feel like when we're not in crisis mode, we're taking time to try to reevaluate and just looking at, are there ways that I can improve my practices in terms of how I'm interacting with children, how I am either assessing things that I'm not quite sure of all the participants in the room, but it's an ongoing cycle that we more than likely are doing as educators. Focus on the informed judgments about practice based on evidence, open-minded, responsive, and inclusive attitudes. Dialogue with other colleagues, including external networks, the capacity to basically adapt and develop frameworks, making informed judgments, and defending or challenging existing practices. Again, kind of a mouthful, but it's just a way of how we're looking at reflective practice from an early childhood standpoint. So part 2 of my story is when I actually entered the classroom. And again, at the time, was I looking at all the definitions of reflective practice? No, absolutely was not. I was in a survival situation. So I'm going to share a story about my survival. I was an early childhood special education teacher. This was back in 2018. Feels like a million years ago. I was working as a preschool pre-K teacher with children and families. The children I was working with were they were children who currently had IEPs, and the majority of my class would be considered self-contained. Thankfully, my local school district has moved to a more inclusion model. Pardon, I had no supervision provided through my current leadership or administration. And then the merging, and basically, while I was there, I pretty much merged the two concepts of reflective supervision and reflective practice. So my first semester at this new campus, I was really excited. I was going to be working, it's Carmichael Elementary School. It's the first school in the community. So there's a lot of rich history. It was built over 60 years ago. And the part that really excited me is one of my dearest early childhood buddies. She also had left the field of social work and came into the classroom. And for the first time, we were both going to be working for the same organization. We collectively shared a lot of cases together. Ironically, we went through the reflective supervision, like group processing and grant process back in 2011. So we knew reflective supervision very well. What I didn't know is that when I started at this campus, that they were going to give me a multi-age classroom, children ranging from young 3s to older 5s. And the way that our system at the time, we didn't really do a lot of multi-age classrooms. And then on top of that, I had children in both my AM and PM class with the most needs. Honestly, I would sit back and I was like, what did I do in my life? Why is this so hard? I went from a setting the year prior where it just was a completely different setup. I had children who experienced a lot of trauma. I had children that were in the foster care system. I also had children that just had some pretty severe needs. But when you start talking about trauma and social emotional needs, it became very overwhelming. The toughest part about that particular year is in my AM class, I had 2 students that were extremely aggressive. So much so, several children in the class were injured. The paraprofessional that was in my classroom also sustained an injury. We were hit on a number of occasions. I share with my students the story every year, and I'm like, you don't understand it till you literally hit with a cube chair or your classroom is completely destroyed. And you're just trying to like understand like what's going on. This is a 4-year-old. I'm trying to advocate for him, advocate for the family. And meanwhile, the other, I would say, I don't want to say the twist plot was also this student. The student was not only in the foster care system, but his foster parent, soon to be adopted parent, was also my lead teacher. So it was a very challenging semester. And it was a semester that I felt like I had no control over anything. It was just like survival mode. I felt like the first quarter. And it wasn't until because I wasn't getting any answers. You know, the response was, we're going to suspend this child. They suspended a 4-year-old. And then at the same time, I'm like, you can't suspend 4-year-olds. This child has these needs. It's on their IEP. And I got to a point where I just couldn't keep going along to get along. And I started looking more back into my reflective practices. And like I said, my dear friend, who it was her first year of teaching, I'll never forget, we were on the phone one night and she said, Dee, we know what to do. And I said, what are you talking about? She's like, you know what we need to do? She's like, we have a reflective background. We need to use it. And it was like the second she said that, it gave me, I just could feel like, yeah, I can't change the behaviors. I can't change what happened in the past. I can't change the system. Nothing is working. All I can do is just really look at like, what can I do? And that's when I feel like, without knowing at the time, we really merged what we learned back in 2011. And we said, this is what we have to do. This is what we have to do for survival. And the second I made that shift from just reacting to everything, because everything was a crisis every day between the professionals coming in, it was just a lot. And the children being injured, I needed to find a sense of control. And that particular semester and quarter very much reminds me of what I hear from teachers today. The class sizes are overcrowded. There's not enough people. There's not enough subs. Children are sick, staff are sick, parents are frustrated. Like everything about that particular time reminds me of this time. And that's why I feel like reflective practice is super important. So when we started merging the two concepts as a team, we decided to meet weekly, to start processing and healing together. And the way our school district was set up at the time is that Thursdays was our professional development day. So we didn't have students on Thursday. It didn't mean we weren't scheduled with stuff. I don't want to sell this idea that, oh, we just had all day to do whatever we want. That was not the case. We had decided that we were going to have a dedicated time to meet as a team, and team meaning all the teachers, all the paraprofessionals, and any specialty providers that would enter our classroom. We were going to meet because we were all collectively impacted by the students in my classroom, whether it was on the playground or just having to send my kids next door. Like, we had to figure out a way, how are we going to make this work? We don't have the resources. We don't really have the support of leadership at this time. And the child was not leaving the classroom. That just was not an option at that particular point. But what I found when we started meeting together and each person was given the time, and we had to have a boundary of time because we still had to work. We would set aside time for about an hour. And basically, it gave each of us a little bit of time to just basically process what happened this week. How did we manage? How did you feel when you had to send the students to the nurse? How did you feel having to go to workman's comp because you were injured on the job? And once we started to just talk about it and say, okay, we've talked about it, but what can we do? What can we do? And did we always have an answer? Not necessarily, but it just allowed us to create new strategies to say, okay, you know, the next time we transition to come into the classroom, or the next time we're going to be on the playground longer, let's figure out a way to transition the student in a different way. Maybe we need to set up an activity in the classroom first. Maybe we need to talk with the parent and see if they could come sooner, so we could kind of prepare the student for what was coming for the day. And it was like, once we started to figure out a plan, then things became less of a crisis. And just having that consistency to meet collectively as a group really made a huge difference. My dear friend, my co-teacher, and I started meeting bi-weekly. And so did we do it during school hours? No, but we had, because of our training in reflective supervision, we knew that we needed to have a dedicated time. And we said, okay, we're going to do this over the phone. And because we were both, working parents and just juggling life. And so we knew Thursday nights were like our evening. And so we would just get on the phone. I would talk about what was going on, and she would just reflect, listen, and I would just slowly come to solutions, or there may not have been a solution. But it was like, instead of being isolated and dealing with everything, it was just the support of having someone acknowledging that there was even something going on in my classroom. So it gave me a little bit more sense of control. The other piece that I started to do, and I had to implement this for myself, and I know this can be difficult as administrators or teachers, but I'm telling you, when you're in crisis, you have to find a way to take a break. For me, and I did not have a very long break, especially working as a public educator, I would sometimes just sit in my car. So I literally said to the team, I need like 20 to 30 minutes alone every day, because my classroom was the middle classroom and everybody would come, like, gravitate into that space. And so it just was hard for me to kind of process the things that were going on that morning and then prepare for another group of children to come in the afternoon. During that break, I would reflect. Sometimes I would cry. Sometimes I would call my better half. Sometimes I drove to get a cup of coffee. Sometimes I walked. I just walked to the park that was right next door to the campus. But I had to do that until I felt like I didn't need to do it anymore. But honestly, it just became a habit, even though eventually we were able to transition the student the following semester. But it was my way of just like getting a sense of control, because every day was a crisis. Every single day. There was never a day that it was calm, and unless the student was absent, unfortunately, but that was just the reality. But it was my way of just really regrouping and really wondering, like, could I have done anything different today? How could I have communicated in a different way with this child or with my paraprofessional? Or how could I help this child and the other children play together? Like, these were just real things that I would wonder about all the time. And again, didn't always have an answer, but it just gave me a little bit more sense of control versus feeling chaotic all the time. And I also didn't want every single conversation to be about the chaos of the day. I'm like, I also can't live in that world either, because that can be really overwhelming. Also, I would suggest, especially during this time, and ironically, my dear friend that helped me, the co-teacher, we've had this conversation recently. And so we were just saying, when it comes to education, trying to find time to set time every week or bi-weekly to meet with a supervisor or meet with your team. And it's 1 to 2 hours a week if you can do it. If it's a half hour, but just so the team can just feel like, okay, I'm heard. I'm not alone. It is overwhelming during this particular time and I'm just thinking about, like, in the nature-based world, more parents are like, okay, I want my kids to go to this program, but also parents are saying, I want my kid to wear a mask. I don't want my kid to wear a mask. And just like feeling overwhelmed all the time. But I think if there's time to, and not talking about like organizational things within that hour, but really taking time to just regroup. And not the, and I don't want to sell the idea of self-care, because there was not like a self-care thing going on during the time that I was working as a public educator. But it was really just talking about, as a group, just reflecting and just allowing everyone to feel like they can be heard, so they can just process and move forward. What we would try to do, if we could, we would try to open up each session with a brief moment of individual reflection or some sort of mindfulness, so we could just enter that space feeling like, okay, we're here. And we didn't just dive in to all the crisis stuff that had been going on, but we would, sometimes we would just play like some soft jazz music and just write some thoughts down. And if you wanted to share your thoughts, you could, but you didn't have to, but you were able to like have an outlet. And that's in a group setting. And we would do this also in reflective supervision. It was always, we were kind of let into the space calmly, and then we would exit that space in a very calmly way. We weren't just automatically dumping everything that was going on. Being an active listener versus trying to find a solution. Working in that public education setting and coming from social work, and then going into a public education setting, I'm like, there was never any kind of control of what I could do. And there was also just never really any real solutions that I could get to because of the way the system was designed. So I feel like it's important that you can listen to each other. Certainly there's ways to change the system, but when you're in that immediate crisis mode, the system cannot be changed in 24 hours. So that's why it's important to be active listeners and really, again, finding a solution may not be the answer at that particular moment, it may come to that point after reflection and discussion and saying, I really think we need to work on adjusting this policy, or I really think we need to work on doing this on a larger scale. But in the immediate moment, there just might be a need to just find some solutions that may be more effective for that time. And then lastly, I would say taking the time to wonder. I think wondering is really important. We do it in early childhood all the time, but we could also do that as educators for ourselves. And I'm going to share some things in the next slide before my closing remarks. Okay. Oh, I didn't put my source, but so questions to consider. Where do you have room in your days for reflective practices? And where might you find reflective minutes? Is there anything about your current classroom children's center that makes you wonder why or what if? And then who can you recruit to begin your journey of reflection with? Could it be a coworker or colleague? Or the children in your classroom or center or community online? So I wanted you guys to take a moment to kind of reflect and think about which one of these questions kind of connects with you more. Does it give you a sense of like, okay, this is not, this is something I could apply very easily. It's not a clinical approach, but it's more or less like it just gives you a sense of like, I can find a way to be a little bit more reflective. And it takes away this, in my opinion, this idea of like, yes, you should take care of yourself. I could take care of myself if I could be a little bit more reflective, and maybe I'll feel like being a little bit more into doing self-care. But I think reflective practices can really give educators just more more tools instead of being reactive to the situation. Do you think that there's a way that you can find time in your day, whether it's being reflected by yourself or with a peer or with with a community online?
Supervise any operation I like. Just the paperwork stuff. Example, you have your warrant.
And you guys can put it in the chat if you would like, or you can unmute and share your thoughts.
Dee, this is Christy. I was just going to draw your attention that Jennifer in the chat shared that she said that I love that you advocated for yourself and the necessity of collaborating as a team. And I was thinking the same as I was listening. I noticed that as you were talking, the word time came up a lot, the idea of taking time, making space. And I just was wondering to myself if, to this point of advocating, putting a name to a practice and saying, we're implementing this practice, we're doing this idea, like you would buy a resource, you would spend, money or time on something else. If you could say, by giving it a name and saying, we're doing this thing, if it can help in advocating for that time, because I think for a lot of people right now, maybe they feel like they don't have that time, but maybe giving it a name can help with that.
I think yes, but I also, and I failed to mention this, and I think I was going to just share this in my closing remarks. And I'm saying this from just experience and working with other educators and those of us that have worked in social work. And I need to say for the record, I'm like a social work, I don't want to say transplant. They adopted me because I've always been an early childhood educator. But much like education and social work, they need people to do the work. And so I'm just thankful for the 10 years of doing the work and the professionals that adopted me and just kind of showed me the ropes of how all of this work works collectively. Okay, so you were asking, is there a word for this? Or I wanted to make sure that I'm actually answering the question. Christy?
Sorry, it was not so much a question as just reflecting Jennifer's comment that that idea of advocating for it, that she really loved that you advocated for yourself when you said, I need this time, we need this space to connect. And so just reflecting that, maybe putting a name to it helps people with that advocacy. But I do
Yes.
see a question here from Erin. I don't know. They asked, I'm curious, what are your favorite questions? What your favorite questions are for that moment of mindful reflection that you use at the start of your conversations?
Oh man. Questions. I don't have a set of questions. I wish I could say like this was the question that I had, or this is what we would come up with. It was really just honestly just being attuned to like what we were feeling in that particular moment. There wasn't like a question per se, but just being present. Like, what's the feeling that I'm feeling right now? What's going on internally with me? Am I thinking about getting off from work and I gotta, pick up my daughter and she has choir or something? Am I even present in the moment to be reflective? And that's really how we tried to approach the mindfulness. We didn't really want to have like expectations on it, because I feel like in our day-to-day like work as educators, there's so much expectation on us. And it was just like, show up to this space, however you feel, whatever it is, this is your time to just kind of like be present. And if you could have the choice to write, or you could take the 5 to 10 minutes to just kind of regroup, and then we collectively would decide, okay, 2 of us would talk today about our reflection, or we would say, all of us are going to talk. It really just depended upon the week, and the type of week of what we experienced with our students. And I feel like I keep focusing on my particular class, but it became something that we collectively were all talking about, our classes and our experiences and the needs of our children and families, versus just, yes, I was in crisis mode, but it became a really safe place for all of us to talk. And I didn't talk about over time the solution of like, we're going to garden with the kids outside. This was also very early on when I was learning about nature-based education. So we came to that solution also collectively during this reflective work.
And on the point of the questions, Janice also had a comment in the chat that says, I like the wondering questions of why and what if, since it seems like a way to maybe move toward problem solving as part of that reflection.
Exactly. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just thinking that I like that there's just a personal reflection for me while we're reflecting, that there's a component potentially of a problem solving piece, but I like that you also allow for the possibility that there's not always a solution, and then that's okay. We don't have to have the burden of being part of this process of feeling like you have to come up with an answer, a solution. Just having the space to talk about it is the first step. There might be a problem, a solution, but not necessarily. I thought that was really interesting.
And I will also say, for what I also like about reflection is I didn't have to take all of that home. So my whole family didn't have to hear everything that was going on every single day. And that was something I really learned through the reflective supervision process, was that this was the space to kind of allow yourself to let everything out, so you're not carrying it all the time. And which leads to my other point, like when you're carrying that type of stress, it will affect your health. It just will. And that's why I just believe in doing it so much. I don't care what type of work I'm doing. I'm always going to find a way to be reflective because I've experienced firsthand what it's like to have some pretty severe health issues come up because I wasn't doing any kind of reflective work. And so my way of just really the real self-care for me was making sure that I was doing the reflective work so I would never be back in a space where I have like an asthma attack or just panic attacks or anxiety or whatever the case may be. But that's how important the work became to me. And anytime I'm able to have a conversation with anyone working in social work or education, I always am concerned about their health. And because if you don't take care of yourself, it will come out in some other way. And your health is your number one, you know.
Yeah, meant to be putting the oxygen mask on yourself before you help the person next to you.
Yeah, exactly.
See, there's a couple of comments that relate to journaling, you know, sort of at the end of the day, or writing down and having time, you know, reflecting with colleagues and writing it down as a piece of that. Any thoughts about that piece, a kind of a journaling piece?
Absolutely. I feel like I've tried a lot of different things. In my youth, I was like a daily journaling type of gal. I still like journaling, but it's very hard for me to just journal my entire day because I'm that type of person when it comes to writing. I want to write all of it. But I've tried like gratitude journals where I can just write one gratitude statement because that's all I have time for. I just can't, for me personally. So part of that, and I have to say, like, I felt guilt. I'm like, I should be able to write and really reflect. But it's like, if that's all I can give, that's all I can do. And at least I'm acknowledging, like, I'm grateful for this, or writing a tough moment. Like, it sometimes not always about gratitude. Sometimes just writing out, like, this was a really tough day, and here's why it was tough. And I think just giving ourselves permission, like journaling doesn't all have to look one way. It's whatever works best for you in that particular moment. That's how I started applying journaling, which now has turned into other creative outlets for myself. But that's my way of approaching it.
And I see, and maybe this could be a good question to end on, unless there are a lot more that come in, but Alejandra is saying that in her case, she feels that there's just never time, always rushing to do things during the day. And just any thoughts about how to change that thinking, how to prioritize this, or maybe how to someone's point earlier, advocate for the time that you need?
Again, when I learned about reflective supervision and they're telling me I'm going to meet with my supervisor 2 hours a week. The first thing I thought, you guys know I'm a service coordinator. I drive all around this rural county. How am I going to have time to meet with anybody for 2 hours when I've got the needs of families and the needs of children? And then I just felt like when I crossed over to public education, it just was like amplified to a whole entire another level. And even when I worked in behavioral health. But I just think in social work, because it's really embedded in social workers, you have to take care of yourself. It's a non-negotiable. And when I think about working in that space where you were going to carve out time because that's just what it was, versus when I studied to become a teacher and then being in that space, it's not even taught. It's not even a concept. It's not even an idea. And that's the part where my friend and I, that was our struggle. We're just like, why is this not even a common thing? We're doing so much, but yet there's no time to breathe. And honestly, we had to just take what we knew and what worked and we just had to do it. For me, I want to say that my lunch break was 30 minutes long. It wasn't very long, but that was my individual time to find that time. It wasn't a lot of time, but it was like, I have to do this. And I had to just set boundaries, because in the working situation that I was in, there were no boundaries. This was not social work. This was not behavioral health. This was nothing compared to what I was doing before, where they forced those boundaries. So as a teacher, I had to create those boundaries. It was worth it, and it was worth it for me because I knew it was very effective before. So I think you just have to decide, and maybe it's not the middle of the day, maybe it's the beginning of the day, maybe it's the end of the day, but you ultimately have to be able to make that decision for yourself, but also realizing the system is not going to, I don't want to say promote it, but that was just my experience when I was in public education.
Well, thank you so much, Dee, and so much appreciation in the chat for your stories and sharing what you know about this. And I think you've given everybody really a lot to think about, and hopefully a little more confidence to say, this is something that I need, this is a priority. If someone is an administrator, to say, this is what the staff needs. Our budget should reflect that we take this time on this regular schedule to do this, because it makes us more effective, it makes us healthier, it makes us happier, it makes our, the education that we provide better. So I hope that this has helped us move that process along for everyone. But of course, there's a lot to it. But thank you so much, Dee. Really so appreciate it.